Hi, welcome to Conversations Over Coffee with me, Reb Steve, Rabbi Steve Wernick from Bethesda Congregation in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. We're excited to have you here today with our guest, Racheli Kaplan, who is Director of Outreach and Community Building from the new Anu Museum in Tel Aviv. Before we get to our conversation with her, we want to remind you that we're on Facebook, YouTube, and betsedek.tv. We appreciate your comments, and if you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to give us a thumbs up. Your comments, of course, help us share this conversation with as many people as possible. If you have a question for our guests, feel free to ask those questions on the chat function of YouTube or Facebook, and we'll do our best to get them into the show. With that out of the way, let me introduce our guest. Racheli Kaplan is more formally the Director of Strategic Partnerships at ANU, the Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv. Prior to that role, she served for 4 years as a Shlicha, as an emissary, right here in Toronto, Canada, on behalf of the Jewish Agency for Israel. During this period, she served as Director of Outreach at Hillel of Greater Ontario. Her role included program development, engaging Reformed congregations and students on campus throughout the city. Additionally, as a Jewish educator and experienced professional, Racheli contributed to the Israeli Consulate Branding Israel project. Racheli holds an MA in International Public Law from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She was the Vice President of Student Union and worked as a project supervisor at the Wellspring of Democratic Education in Jerusalem. She has lots and lots of credentials that make her an ideal person for the role that she now has. In addition to Hebrew and she is fluent in English. Racheli also speaks Russian, French, conversational German, and Spanish. That's enough to make you feel like you don't know that much. Please join me in welcoming Racheli Kaplan to the conversation.
Thank you, Rabbi Steve. This is always awkward to hear my own bio, but thank you for having me.
You know, bios are written for your mothers to shep nachas.
That's true, and my mother sure has nachas.
So Racheli, you know, but let's jump right into the conversation. The ANU Museum is new. You know, having visited the museum and experienced you as a docent to take me through it, it's really not connected to the Museum of the Diaspora. It's actually, I think, something quite different and new. But before we get into that, give us a little bit of a history of that space and the legacy that the ANU Museum holds as being the successor to the Museum of the Diaspora.
Sure. And I would also encourage and invite our participants today to write in the chat if they've been to the old museum, if they've been to the new one, what do they recall from the old one, and we can refer to that later, maybe in the questions period. So for over 4 decades, Bet Tfutzot has been playing an integral role in strengthening Jewish identity and perpetuating Jewish heritage worldwide. Some of you may recall the old museum that opened in 1978. It was cutting edge that drew visitors from all over the world. But as time went by and technology ran down, and more importantly, the narrative changed, we really felt compelled to change the new museum. We no longer believe the story as portrayed in the old museum concludes in the Jews returning to the homeland. We acknowledge, we welcome, and we even trust in the fact that there are many thriving Jewish communities around the world, and Toronto being one of the leading ones, of course, and not because I'm biased about it. So the story of the Jewish people is a story for constant renewal. So we too, as a nation, as a national institution, embarked on an ambitious overhaul, taking over 12 years, a little bit longer than what we expected, and an investment of $100 million, a little short of what we expected. If Daniel can show us the first video, we can. I'm not sure, we had some technical issues with the first video. If it does work, we can see what the new museum looks like. And then we can talk about the principles that led our overhaul program.
So apparently that first video is a little too big for this particular platform.
Okay.
So we can't get that overlook into it.
Okay. So we can see the second video, I guess, about the 4 weeks.
Hello and welcome to ANU, the Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv. This is the largest museum of its kind in the world, with over 72,000 square feet of exhibition space, hundreds of original objects, 50 specially produced films, and 25 state-of-the-art interactive display areas. Over 10 years in the making, we've just opened our doors to this must-see destination. The museum consists of 4 wings spanning 3 floors. This wing is dedicated to the vibrant and rich life of the Jewish people today. It highlights Jewish contribution to arts and culture, including theater, dance, music, cinema, folklore, and, of course, humor. The Hebrew language and modern literature, the tapestry of Jewish denominations, and the contribution of Jews to humanity. On this wing, we encounter the unique and ongoing story of the Jewish people, beginning in antiquity and extending to our times. The Jewish story, spanning thousands of years, includes periods of prosperity, thriving, and cultural dialogue, as well as times of oppression and persecution. It culminates with the resurrection of the Jewish people after the Holocaust, the establishment of the State of Israel, and varied Jewish communities throughout the world. This wing presents the conceptual foundations that are the backbone of Jewish existence: Shabbat, the covenant, the yearly cycle, individual life cycle milestones, and a section dedicated to the Bible and its influence on world culture, especially as it relates to concepts of justice and liberty, the 10 Commandments, as well as the ubiquity of the Bible in our language, folklore, art, and culture. This wing focuses on the evolution of the synagogue as an institution, beginning with the temple in Jerusalem through to the present. 21 synagogue replicas from various locations and eras tell the story of Jewish assembly, worship, and study, while films and interactives depict various forms of congregation. Specially selected artifacts help tell the story, and a dedicated interactive invites visitors to take a journey through the world of Jewish liturgical music, piyutim, performed by artists such as Barbra Streisand and Leonard Cohen.
I almost feel like this video conveys just a taste of what the museum stands for, but hopefully it will get the curiosity and taste buds going for all the participants to come and visit us.
So there's a lot in that video. Why don't we just start with first and foremost, what's the essential difference between Beit HaTfusot and Anu in terms of the narrative? You talked about how the narrative has changed. What was the old narrative and what's the new narrative?
So the museum opened in 1978 after a decade long of planning, thanks to the vision of Nahum Goldman, who was at the time president of the World Jewish Congress. In 2005, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, passed a law defining the museum as a national institution, national center for Jewish communities around the world. But the museum was outdated. The people who stood behind developing the museum at the time, what used to be known as Beit HaTfusot, House of the Diaspora, really reflected the Jewish story from a very specific point of view. And if some of you recall, the end of the exhibition would end in the menorah when you ascend upstairs to say the story concludes with you making Aliyah. If you haven't made Aliyah yet, you're just about to. But that's where the story ended. We know today, and we've known for quite a while, that this is no longer the narrative the Jewish people stand for. We now have vibrant Jewish communities around the world standing alongside with the state of Israel. So that was one of the principles that we knew we want to change. The other principle was the curators at the time and the developers of the museum were all male, not only male, but also Ashkenazi. There was little representation for women. There was hardly any representation for non-Ashkenazi communities. And that's something else that we wanted to reflect in the new museum. Lastly, and more importantly, the old museum did not have a collection of artifacts. And we strongly believe that no matter how impressive and important cutting-edge technology is, using interactives and using modern technology today, we never dismiss the power of an artifact. So today we have our own collection with different items, different Judaica, that we either got on loan or we purchased or we generously were donated. So today the museum is completely different than what it used to be, with all the due respect that we owe, and we are grateful for what our past museum staff had done.
And when people come to the museum, what is it that you want them to know, to do, and to feel as a result of being there?
So I think one of the things that we always say and we quote on different pamphlets and brochures and on our website, that ANO is more than a museum. We operate on site, online, and all over the world. We are a hub to create programs and educational initiatives and different cultural events to make sure that they all tie to the Jewish story. But I think that the largest message that I'd like to convey is that we wish everyone would see themselves at the museum.
And how would people go about seeing themselves at the museum?
So when embarking on the overhaul program, we being the curators, not me personally, we set three main principles that are going all through our programs and the new exhibition. We know today how the Jewish people were influenced through history, but we also were influenced, and we would like visitors of all backgrounds to see themselves when they come to the museum. We welcome visitors of all ages, genders, nationalities, and religion, and we consciously develop the story of the museum so that everyone can see themselves and everyone is part of the story. So that would be our first principle. The second reflects the plurality, not necessarily the pluralism, even though we strong believers in that as well, but the plurality of the Jewish people. We express the Jewish people as it is today, reflecting the many denominations, practices, and affiliations. The diversity and inclusivity are one of our core values in developing the exhibition, the new museum, and our different programs. I will open brackets, as we say in Hebrew, and say that when I was in Toronto as a Shlicha, so I came as a Shlicha on behalf of the Reform movement, and I thought everything was very black and white. There's the Reform movement, there's the Conservative movement, and there's the Orthodox. And it was only when I arrived to Toronto and visited everything between Thornhill and downtown that I realized there are so many expressions of being Jewish. You can go to the village shul, you can go to the aesthetic, you can choose to go to Holly Blossom for some of the programs, and it's something that I carry with me till today, that very strong, multifaceted Jewish experience in Toronto. Lastly, not missing the atrocities, the pogroms, and the tragedies that we underwent as a Jewish people, I think we are now in a safe spot enough to say that we can celebrate our achievements and our accomplishments and the influence we had on other cultures. To quote our chief curator, Dr. Racheli, she always says, it's about time we transition from Oy Gewalt to Hallelujah. And I think that's one of the core principles you can see and witness throughout our programs and the new museum.
Tell us some of the ways in which the museum makes that transition from Oy Gewalt to Hallelujah. The first thing that I think comes to my mind when you say Hallelujah, and you talk about Canada, of course, Steve Leonard Cohen.
Of course.
And he's there.
He's there more than others. Yeah, we have a really soft spot for Leonard Cohen. So I would address first Leonard Cohen. We have produced a video based on materials that we got from his bequest. And it's a short video, 12-minute long, that depicts his relationship with Israel throughout his different performances, whether it's through army military bases in 1973, through his last concert in Ramat Gan in 2009, and throughout these videos on different quotes, we really see the Jewish influence that he had on his creative life as a singer, a performer, and an artist. And more than that, we are also having on display his guitar that we got from his family on loan. It's considered to be a permanent loan, but at this time, it's only a loan. And it's the guitar that he played in Ramat Gan and his last concert. It was a huge concert. I regret to this day that I missed it, but I was back in Canada. He concluded the concert by doing the Birkat Kohanim on the audience, which he knew offhand. And I think that he's really one of those unique artists that raised the question whether his work is Jewish or whether it's just influenced by his upbringing. And we try throughout the museum to raise questions for our visitors. We're not here necessarily to provide the answers, but rather make people wonder and question themselves. What does it mean, Jewish culture? What does it mean for me to experience Jewish theater or Jewish cinema or Jewish art or Jewish cuisine? Because all of these in different fragments, all of they encompass today the Jewish identity that we all have.
One of my favorite stories about that was with Steven Spielberg, who has a new movie coming out, which is
True, The Fableman.
Right? So, and also I shared with you that Spielberg grew up at my first synagogue in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Well, it was then in Haddon Heights, New Jersey. So tell us a little bit about the way in which that question of is it Jewish, impacts the larger culture as it related to Spielberg's contribution to the museum.
So our third floor, as you heard in the video, my CEO Dan Tadmor explaining, is called the Mosaic. This is a floor that meets the visitors upon arrival in the here and now. This is the floor that explores cultural achievements and cultural influences that the Jewish people had in modern era. So this floor is divided to different topics such as theater, cinema, literature, cuisine, art, luminaries, and others. In the cinema part, we present different Jewish influencers who have made a contribution towards the field of cinema. And cinema is not just Hollywood, lo and behold, but it's really between Hollywood and Bollywood and anything in between. Throughout the effort that our curatorial team has made to build a new museum, they've approached Steven Spielberg, and he graciously granted them one of the original E.T. dolls. So if you may all recall, this is weird extraterrestrial doll alien coming to visit a family here in the United States. And we have it on display. So first of all, younger generation, not necessarily familiar with E.T. So I feel like we're really doing justice with Steven Spielberg, talking about E.T. and sharing that marvelous story that I grew up with. But we also talk about Steven Spielberg as a producer and as a director, someone who did so many movies between E.T. and Schindler's List. And how do we really define whether that's a Jewish artwork or not? So if we went out to do the tour, I would ask the audience what do they think, and they're welcome to write in the meantime. But I will say that we've asked Steven Spielberg that question, and he said 100% this is a Jewish work, because when I wrote the story,
meaning E.T. is a Jewish work.
E.T. is a Jewish work, right? And the reason for that he explained is that in many ways he saw himself as that extraterrestrial visitor, that he grew up not among a Jewish community, not among a strong Jewish community. He saw himself as different. He had different customs. And if you mentioned that film coming up soon, The Fablemans, there's a really charming scene when he's pulling through to the driveway and all the houses are decorated with Christmas lights, except for his house that's dark. And he says to the cab driver, that's the house that there's no lights in. And I think that when he sees himself as extraterrestrial, that's what defines it to be a more Jewish-like story, something that we can all relate to on different levels, but the roots are definitely there in the Jewish story.
Yeah, and take it even further. It's a stranger in a strange land who's only seeking to go home.
Right.
And for the Jewish people, that going home was going back to the land of Israel, Eretz Israel.
Right.
The other thing that Spielberg says, I haven't seen The Fableman yet, but the other thing that I've read about it is when he talked about I think it was being in Arizona, that all of his peers called him by his last name, Spielberg,
right.
As if to make it known that he was different, that he had that Berg there, and that he was a Jewish person.
Right.
So Schindler's List is obviously a Jewish film. E.T. is not necessarily one that you would think is being a Jewish film, but when you hear it from Steven Spielberg himself, certainly it comes that way.
And you mentioned earlier Leonard Cohen, which we really do have a soft spot at the museum for, but about 6 years ago, we had an exhibition about Bob Dylan celebrating his 75th anniversary or 75th birthday. And we got a lot of critics saying, hey, but Bob Dylan is not Jewish. So first of all, he went out of being Jewish, if that's even a term in English, and then he went back to being Jewish. But he did state multiple times that his Jewish upbringing, that his Jewish texts that he read were all influencing his creative work as an artist. So even if he drew apart or drifted away from being a practicing Jew, his creation is still a Jewish one.
You know, Dylan went to a Jewish summer camp in Webster,
Oh my
Wisconsin.
God, Rabbi Steve, you're connected to all the important people.
I am. Herzl, he went to Herzl camp in Webster, Wisconsin. I was the education director there.
We had photos from that camp.
Yeah. I was the education director there in the 80s. I went to the University of Minnesota.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, my life has been pretty remarkable in that way. It's 1 degree of separation I have.
But now I envy you that you're in Toronto, so that's the best.
Well, don't envy me because it's pretty cold here. I was in Tel Aviv last week. It was a lot warmer.
That's true.
What are some of the highlights? What are some of the other highlights of the museum for you, Racheli? What are some of your favorite exhibitions and artifacts?
Can I say that I love it all?
Yeah,
I really do think very highly.
Something specific.
I really love, so I will say that throughout the 9 years that I've been at the museum, I've never been part of the curatorial team, which allows me today to take all the compliments and not to blush because they've really put so much effort into it. And witnessing the construction, the development of the museum made also very high expectations. So when we started the construction just before COVID, and I was going through the museum, seeing how they putting out the different artifacts and putting down the old walls and etc., I was really thinking whether they will match the expectation of having this miraculous museum. And once it was opened, I was really at awe. It took me a few days to go over the entire museum that spans over 7,000 square meters. It's the largest Jewish museum in the world. I really feel that it reflects the Jewish story today. I feel like visitors can each find something that speaks to them, whether it's children in the children's gallery or young adults who will probably connect to the cultural floor, or people who are fascinated with the Jewish story will connect to the journey floor. If I have to choose one display that really speaks volumes to me, is the one that you may recall on the 3rd floor. We have 7 screens with 21 individuals sharing in 60 seconds in 7 languages. What does it mean for them to be Jewish today? And I encourage always our guides, our docents, to ask that question the visitors that they meet. What does it really mean to be Jewish today? And when you hear Rabbi Browse from Los Angeles speak about her experience, or when you hear Rabbi Adam Mintz, or you hear Flora from Moscow, who has recently fled Moscow to Israel because of the situation with the Ukraine, you really see the different elements that hold us together as a people. And it's not about practicing one custom or other, but it's really being us together, Anu, as the museum stands for.
So I'm going to ask a somewhat of a charged question for that. In light of the outcome of the recent Israeli elections and some of the reported statements that are coming from the religious Zionist parties, Ben Gvir and Smotrich in particular, does the museum see itself as playing any kind of role? There's a tension between the message of the museum, which is quite inclusive, and the message that's coming from the religious Zionist parties that seem to be quite exclusive. Does the museum see itself as having any kind of voice or role in that conversation?
Absolutely. And I don't think that it's even such a charged question. So I challenge you to ask me even more charged questions.
Okay.
The museum definitely has a role. We're the leading establishment today in Israel, promoting a sense of peoplehood programs and connecting the Jewish people throughout the world. As a national museum, one third or 1/4 of our funding comes from the government. And this government is not dependent on which elections happen. So our funding is secured. We're open on Shabbat because we believe that the museum needs to serve all populations, and the ones who are working throughout the week should be still able to come to Shabbat. But we don't operate cashier, shop, or cafe because we believe that people need to have their day of rest. We were never told what to put at the museum or what not to put. We have received some critics about certain displays, but it was never in a way that to boycott or not to arrive to the museum. In fact, specifically during Chol HaMoed, just recently Sukkot, the museum was packed with audiences that you might not expect to see at the museum. And we welcome everyone to come and enjoy it. And one of the strong messages that the museum wishes to deliver, and I really hope that we're doing that successfully, is that a visitor can come and say, how come I'm not represented? So let's say I come from Farsi descent and I don't see enough of myself at the museum. That's a critic that I can address, and I can try to improve it, and I can definitely welcome that type of feedback. I will not welcome a feedback of a visitor coming, how come you're there? How come there's a woman with a talit? How come there are LGBTQ? That's something that we don't welcome. We hear it sometimes, but very little. So in that sense, I think we're doing a good job of balancing and enabling different visitors to see different displays, different objects, all encompassing the story of Anu.
Are there Haredi visitors to the museum? Do they come in groups, or is it just individuals that are making that choice?
There's both. We have some Haredi schools that are coming. We have Haredi individuals. I mentioned Chol HaMoed. We usually open for free for the public, and there's a flux in visitors during that period. And we see really visitors of all backgrounds. The one thing that I learned at the museum when we opened the new wing, so that's 5 years ago, the synagogue hall, which features 21 synagogue models. Most of them are Orthodox, except for one. But we produced different films about different practices of Jewish life, including Rabbi Buchdal singing Unetanat Tokef, including Kabbalat Shabbat in, I always forget, Burning Man Festival. And the one thing that I learned from Haredi visitors is that ability that I wish I had in life is to look the other way. There was no demonstrations, there were no boycott, there was no shouting or screaming, chas v'chalila. They just looked the other way. And I think it teaches us that they know that there is different practices of Jewish life. They choose not to uphold that or respect that, but they still acknowledge that it exists. Or at least that's what I hope that they are.
From your mouth to God's ears. Let me ask you one last question. What are the ways in which we at Betzedek or in Toronto might become partners with the museum? What's available to us to do from a distance?
I'm so grateful for the question. It's so we have different ways to connect, and you'll be hearing from me more after we finish this lovely conversation. First of all, I would love to invite visitors or participants of this conversation to come and visit the museum. If Daniel would so kindly put up the last slide, it has my contact information and a QR, which I'm happy for you to distribute, Rabbi, to the community. If they contact me, I'm happy to offer them free admission, a tour of the museum, and I always welcome Canadians when they come to Israel.
So there you have it. Take this QR code, and when you're in Israel, contact Racheli and say you saw her on Conversations Over Coffee with Betzedek and you want to visit.
Exactly. Second, for those who are not yet traveling to Israel or perhaps don't have plans yet to travel, I would love to offer you a free online tour. So our educational department has begun doing online tours during COVID, and they've been so successful that we've expanded them to the present period as well. So we have different tours that last about 45 minutes. It's with a docent, it's live. We can schedule that for the community, maybe through your office, and this way your congregates can have a taste of what the museum feels like, because it's a bit unfair that you and I speak about a museum we've been to, and perhaps some of them haven't yet. Lastly, and of no less significant, is the slide just the one before this. It's a project called com.unity. So I mentioned before that we really want visitors to see themselves when they come to the museum. This is one of our flagship programs where we invite communities, in this case a congregation, but not only, to send us their information, to send us photographs, stories, anecdotes. What makes them a community? Do they have a yearly event, experiences, etc.? And this information is being edited and then uploaded to the museum, to the com.unity interactive. This way, when we have visitors coming from Toronto, if they search Toronto, Beth Tzedek will come up. I checked this morning, we're not up there yet. So hopefully after this conversation, we'll be able to include Beth Tzedek as well.
Okay. Danielle, can you bring us back? There we go. So there you have it. Lots of ways to be involved with the museum, both in person and online. And this being Israel's 75th Yom Ha'atzmaut, it's a great opportunity to go and to visit. And now you have a friend at the museum as well. Racheli, thank you so much for the conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I really, really enjoyed my visit to the museum, and I look forward to going back again sometime in the near future.
Thank you so much.
Be sure to join us next week as we continue our conversations over coffee, apparently with people whose names are Rachel, as Rachel Gildener, who is the founder and CEO of Gather DC, will be in conversations over coffee, and we'll talk about her important work for engaging the next generation of Jews in the greater Washington, D.C. area. For now, thanks for joining us. Have a good week. Shavua Tov, everyone.
Thank you. Shavua Tov.